Welcome, everybody. We're just going to give it a minute as people join us. Thank you for giving up your lunch breaks, maybe having your lunch and combining it. So others will be no doubt joining us. But this is our webinar on assisted suicide or assisted dying. We might even get into why that language is so important and contested on this. So look, welcome. Thank you. Here we are recording this, just so you know. What we're going to do is we're going to produce the video of this and make that available to those who potentially couldn't join us. There is a chat function and you can put questions in the chat. If you do that, I should be able to see them. I will try and keep an eye on them, and potentially at the right point, we'll be bringing those into the mix. I am joined today my name's Peter Lynas. I'm the UK Director of the Evangelical Alliance, and joining me in terms of answering the questions and giving you the detail are Danny Webster, our Director of Advocacy, and Alicia Edmund, who is our Head of Public Policy. They are also my kind of co-hosts in sharing the responsibility for cross-section. I just say that if you're not already listening to cross-section where you get your podcast, why not? We've covered this issue. We will continue to, and lots of others. But we're going to look through roughly the kind of principles around this bill, the policies in detail, some of the specifics, and the process of that. We hope to do that over the course of about 30 minutes. And then there's a further 15 minutes for questions. But if that helps you planning your lunch break and your timings, we'll do that. So we'll look at why we oppose the bill, what's in the bill, some of the specifics around that, the process of a private member's bill and why that might be important, and then finally just how to engage, and then that chance for questions. But I'm going to kick off a little bit more just around how we think about this bill kind of biblically and theologically in our engagement, just to really help us frame this. We are all image bearers. The Bible teaches us that human beings are unique in all of creation because we are made in the image of God. Genesis 1:26, let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule and steward creation. Psalm 8 then reminds us that human beings are made a little lower than the angels. We are crowned with glory and honor. Psalm 139, certainly a favorite of mine. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. So we are created for him and by him, and in him we live and move and have our being. We are image bearers. That's our kind of starting point. And then the biblical text is very clear that killing is prohibited. That starts in Genesis 9. It's directly linked to the fact that we are made in the image of God. The sixth commandment flows out of that about not murdering. And there are probably two instances that people sometimes talk about in the Bible around assisted dying. Abimelech, who thought he'd been fatally wounded, and lady drops a stone on his head, and so he doesn't want to die at the hands of a woman, and so asks his armor bearer to help end his life. And the other is an Amalekite who killed Saul. Or did Saul end his own life? At the very end of Samuel, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you get two different kind of perspectives on that. But they are both treated negatively in the text. So killing is prohibited. We're all image bearers. Killing's prohibited. But the challenge, I think, in our culture right now is around control and around fear. That's where a lot of the cultural conversation goes. And we are reminded throughout the Bible that God is in control, not us. I mean, take, for example, in 1 Samuel, the Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. And we as Christians have been redeemed by Jesus' death on the cross. We are not our own. We have been bought with a price. Our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. And that's not an individual idea. It's just, oh, I am a temple of the Holy Spirit. It's that we collectively are, and then we are part of a larger body. So reminding us of my kind of final point in my little bit, that we are communities of compassion is what we're called into in terms of church life. We are to defend the weak and the fatherless, to uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, to rescue the weak and the needy. The prophets remind us of that again and again. But core to that is that we are communities where we suffer with other people. That is what compassion literally means and leads us to. And it's much more nuanced than simply ending suffering. We actually have a theology of suffering. Suffering is part of the fabric of Christianity. That's not to in any way be shamefully glorifying pain, but it is a recognition that Jesus died on the cross out of love for us, and a love that we are called to through its fullest expression, participation in various ways. And so if the goal and the objective is to minimize suffering, the options do look different, including the ending of your own life, if that's the goal. But if the goal is to maximize care, that affects the options and our theology, and I think the risk then of coercion of the most vulnerable in what's being proposed takes assisted suicide for us off the table. We are, as a church, to be communities of dignity, communities of flourishing, not dependent on what we have done and what we can contribute to society, but on who He is and what He has done for us. So we wanted to set that little bit of a frame. I am now going to introduce the first of our specialist guests who knows way more about this bill and what's being proposed than I do. So Danny, I'm going to come to you first to set out why we at the Evangelical Alliance are opposed to this bill. And a reminder, somebody's already in on the chat, I think, with a question. You can do that at any time, and I'll try and gather those up and then put them to our experts along the way.
Thank you, Peter. So just to take forward what Peter said, we do have on the basis of what we believe, an in principle opposition to the idea of assisted suicide or assisted dying. And actually, it is worth just making a very brief note on the terms that are used. Assisted suicide is the broad term for helping someone to take their own life. The other word sometimes used is euthanasia. That's where someone is permitted to help someone take their own life. So it's that active involvement of another person. But you'll hear a lot about assisted dying. Assisted dying is actually just the same thing. It's assisted suicide. It is used as a term, often by campaigners in favor of a change of the law, to make the point that someone might already be dying or in the process towards death, and this is just helping along that process. However, it is assisted suicide. The law that will be changed is the Suicide Act. It will change the law that relates to how someone committing suicide is assisted in doing that. So that's just a brief side note. So we do have an in-principle opposition to this, and I think this is for a few key reasons. And these build on the biblical principles Peter has outlined. Our goal should be to protect life, and that means we don't want to normalize suicide. In all other contexts, suicide is something that is a tragic situation. It is something we address with compassion, and we want to seek to minimize it, to help people to avoid going down that path. So to introduce legislation that permits it, that even might encourage it, is to normalize something that we would want to see minimized and reduced. So that is one of the reasons why we oppose it. It is also based on, I think, a false idea around choice and control. A lot of the language you hear promoting this particular legislation or other legislation like it is to give people choice and control. But the individual choices that I make, that you make as individuals, have to be balanced. And the choices that we permit as a society, they have to be balanced with what is good for the whole of society. And that means that we do restrain ourselves in some of the choices we take, and we restrain ourselves in some of the choices we permit people in a society to take. So I think the language around choice and control can be a false one and can suggest that we really can have autonomy and choice in every area. And actually, there are some things where it isn't right that we have that choice or use that choice. And then the third general point is that our priority should be helping people towards the end of life. It should be helping them to have meaningful choices about what happens towards the end of their life, how they are looked after. Most people would choose to die either in their home or in a hospice or with care from loved ones. We want to ensure that that care and that support is absolutely at the forefront of attention, rather than directing attention away from that into people potentially taking their own life prematurely. So we want to, instead of looking down this route towards assisted suicide, focus our attention on how we can promote good end of life care and how that is done to the best of our abilities. Um, I'm going to now pass over to my colleague Alicia Edmund, who is going to talk specifically about the bill that is going to be debated in Parliament in just over a week's time.
Thank you very much, Danny. So very much so moving from the theological framework, our position as an organisation and how we're advocating amongst parliamentarians, now coming into the specifics. So the bill sets out proposals of what it describes as the ideal situation for an assisted death. The bill sponsor, King Leadbeater, speaks of safeguards, which Danny and I are going to unravel and unpick following on from this. But just to set the process of what the bill is proposing, it is saying that an individual aged 18 years who is registered with a general practitioner in England and Wales is eligible to request assisted death. It's important that they have a terminal prognosis where death is the likely outcome within 6 months. Another key criteria within this is speaking about the issue of capacity, where this individual is making the decision with a clear, settled, informed wish to end their life, where it's free from coercion and pressure. And that's a point that we're definitely going to be returning to. So at that point where the patient is requesting an assisted death, they need to sign a declaration. This is called the first declaration. And at that point, they are producing 2 forms of ID. This is witnessed by the coordinating doctor, and another person is also witness to this. Moving on from that first declaration, we then have the coordinating doctor, who assesses the eligibility criteria. Is this person over 18 years? Is this person registered with the GP in England and Wales? Has this person come to this decision free from coercion and control? And so that's the principle. If the coordinating doctor believes that this individual has and does fit the criteria, then they are to sign a statement to that effect. And there is what follows after that, a 7-day reflection between the first assessing doctor and the second doctor's assessment. The role of the second assessment is organised by a medical practitioner, and in the bill, this is described and defined as the independent doctor. Their role, similarly, in this is to assess the criteria, and there are provisions within the bill that there can be a level of cross conversation between the first assessment, but they are to come to an independent conclusion on whether this patient has clear and made a voluntary decision to pursue assisted death. They too need to sign and date and make a statement, and this is then passed on both to the patient and to the coordinating doctor. All of that is then moved and proceeds onto the High Court. The role of the court is to review all of these documentations, the request and the first declaration that came from the patient, the coordinating doctor's assessment alongside the independent doctor's assessment. However, at this stage, the High Court may ask for the patient to either attend via video link or attend in person. This is at the discretion of the judge. They are asking and requesting either in writing of the assessment or follow-up of the coordinating doctor or the independent doctor. And should the judge conclude that the process is satisfactory, then they make a declaration to say that the requirements of the Act has been met. Following this, the patient is then required to sign a second declaration in signalling their intent to continue on to an assisted death to take place. And there is a 14-day reflection between the coordinating doctor and the patient self-administering the drug. And as Danny previously spoken about, this is a conversation around not just assisted death, but physician-assisted suicide. Because ultimately what the bill is permitting and actually changes in law is the Section 2A, which is quite a formality of the Suicide Act 1961, whereby what was previously a criminal offence to encourage or assist someone's suicide or attempted suicide, this bill, if it became law, would overrule that because it's essentially permitting a physician to facilitate the drug that the individual, the patient themselves would take. And the second point of why this is an assisted suicide leading into that point is because the patient themselves are required to administer and to take the drug themselves. At this point, it's unknown if this is by pills, this is unknown by injection, but they are responsible for taking this. This isn't the doctor that would administer that. And so there is many layers, many issues of safeguard. The bill proposes what seems like a linear process, a level of accountability. But just handing back to Danny, we're going to unpack and explore some of the safeguard concerns in how does that really work in reality.
Thank you. So this bill is relatively complex for what is quite a small piece of legislation, and we're going to try not to get too much into the weeds of the detail, but it's helpful to think beyond the principles of our opposition to assisted suicide. Why is this bill a bad bill? For some people, the principle will be enough, but for other people, and many members of parliament may be in this group, they might not oppose it in principle, but they would want a bill that is sufficiently rigorous and safe. And in our engagement, it's important that we make both principled arguments, but then also the practical arguments for why we think this legislation is wrong. And the first one is that the safeguards are weak. It has been said that this bill has more extensive safeguards than any other legislation. I would say it has more processes and bureaucratic processes than other pieces of legislation. But what it does is it just creates a bureaucratic process that leads towards someone having an assisted suicide. So it is more bureaucratic than actually safeguarding the protection of the individuals. And within that, this is a one-sided process. It is a path towards taking that decision. Doctors within this are given the freedom to introduce the topic to patients. Now, a doctor can choose not to engage in this. They don't have any requirement to do this. They can choose not to. But what they do have a requirement to do is then to refer a patient on to this, to another doctor that they believe will be willing to do it. So if they have an objection to doing this, they can't say, sorry, I don't want anything to do with this. They are required to refer on. And on a broader level, this bill gives the health service a duty to ensure that there is adequate provision of assisted suicide administration in whatever form that takes for people in the country. So it is a process that not only permits but supports people in this decision. At the legal level, there are also concerns about the one-sided process. Judges do not have a conscientious objection if they don't want to take part in this process. If a case or an application comes before a judge, they can't refuse to engage with it. And where there is, if a judge turns down an application, the patient can appeal against that rejection. But if a judge approves an application, there is no right of appeal, for example, from someone's wider family. If they feel like someone might have been coerced or pushed into it, there is no appeal against an application being approved. So the process is one-sided and it pushes people towards this decision. And while Alicia said that this is for self-administered drugs, actually there is even a provision within the bill that the doctor can assist in that. It's not clear what exactly that might mean, but all of the way along there are concerns about how actually this might be conducted. And that brings us to a major point, that people towards the end of their life are in an incredibly vulnerable situation, and legislation must place them at the centre and prioritize their protection. There is a real risk of people being coerced, or even coercion suggests a strong influence. It might not even be as explicit as that. People may feel as though they are becoming a burden on their family or even a strain on services in our society, and therefore feel that actually the best thing for them to do is to end their life prematurely. So that risk of coercion is really present, and doctors are not equipped to make the decisions or to make the judgment as to whether anyone is free of coercion. This is something that has been picked up by doctors over the last couple of weeks, that they are not equipped to do this. They don't have the tools to make those decisions. So they're being asked to sign paperwork that they can't necessarily have the evidence that someone hasn't been coerced. And then the final point is that in pushing this legislation forward, it will inevitably affect how palliative care is provided. Palliative care is a bit of a postcode lottery. It is often provided by charities. It is rarely funded through the state, and therefore more affluent areas have better provision of hospices than those who are most deprived. So actually people who are sometimes in more difficult circumstances may feel that this is a better opportunity or a better prospect for them to take because other services aren't providing, and nothing in this bill will encourage or improve palliative care. I'm going to hand back to Peter at this point.
So thank you, Danny. Really helpful, because I think some of you, as Alicia was explaining it, and certainly as I first read it, you're thinking, oh, this seems like there's some stringent safeguards here, there's some protections, and that's certainly the language that's being used out there in the media. But as Danny points out, it's actually highly bureaucratic. Lord Mumby, the former head of the family courts, has said this bill is profoundly unsatisfactory and permits a secret process which can give us no confidence that it will enable the courts to identify and prevent possible abuses. It is lamentably short on adequate safeguards. The reason that's important is he was head of the division that these cases would go to. He's not convinced that the court process works. We've got the ability to do this by proxy. We've got the issue around the coercion. So, Alicia, you're going to unpack just a little bit more some of the concerns around that safeguarding and some of the ability even to make changes to this bill. Because although it says this, there are places where there's some discretion given. So give us some more of those concerns that we have.
Absolutely. I think throughout the bill, there is a real the language is generalist in tone. So there's a lot of may do this. The courts may engage with the doctors. The coordinating doctor may engage with the person's general practitioner to understand more of the wider health circumstances beyond the terminal diagnosis. I think something else just to draw on, which was specific about the first declaration, there are clauses and there are provisions within this bill whereby if the individual cannot sign the first declaration, that they can request someone to sign by proxy. And the caveat even more around that is that it excludes people who are relatives. I think the bill, those who have been writing the bill are trying to lean into that language of trying to avoid undue pressure from family or potential those who would benefit from their death. So no spouse or civil partner-in-law or aunt or sibling or etc. is present to witness or sign in proxy that declaration, but equally not the practitioner who is involved in making that patient's terminal diagnosis. So what you actually have in effect is those who know both the emotional state, most of the kind of relational, the context that's surrounding that individual patient care, as well as the doctor that is, or the clinician that has made the diagnosis, they are removed. And what you actually have is people that are not informed relationally about this patient, that leaves them somewhat exposed and vulnerable to continue moving on in this process. Another part as well that is referenced, and Danny spoke about this, is that should the second independent doctor go through the assessment, go through the eligibility criteria, assess the patient's ability to make an informed decision, and they judge that actually they do not wish to participate or do not think that this patient meets the threshold to continue in moving on assisted dying, those reservations, those concerns are not brought to the court, and they're not referred or conferred between the coordinating doctor. Instead, what has happened, that intel, that knowledge, that insight is cast aside, and the continued shopping for a doctor who will approve this is what takes place. And I think coming back to that point of coercion, control, vulnerabilities, state of capacity. Capacity is not static. From the moment of terminal diagnosis, there's so much other kind of incidents and situations, both either mental, neurological, or even social within surrounding the patient that affects their decision making. None of that can be explored because the end goal is to somewhat rubber stamp the end direction, the end goal that an assisted death can take place. And just to pick up on what this bill essentially is doing, is that it is creating within the health and social sector an assisted death pathway for which institutions and individuals are complicit. So the fact that the individual needs to be registered with the GP means that the conscientious clauses are not sufficiently strong enough that a GP could refuse to pass on details or to talk to the coordinating doctor. They're complicit. They have to refer on. Similarly, the Secretary of State, particularly the Health and Social Care Secretary, has to comply with new guidelines for who and what the training criteria is for the medical practitioners, as well as the rules around drugs, its transportation, etc. And so many institutions are pulled into this to make the pathway for an assisted death suicide viable. And there are very little, once this comes into law, that can happen or shift and change in that direction. It's kind of a pathway to making that happen. So they're just some of the concerns that we've outlined further on our website and will continue to raise in the coming days in the lead up to the 29th.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alicia. We're going to just give those details in a moment, exactly when the vote is and when it's, how you can engage. I'm going to come to Danny in one moment just on the process of how we got there. So we've highlighted obviously these issues around control, that it seems personal choice is being prioritized over the risk of coercion of some of the most vulnerable in our society. And coercion sounds forceful, but of course there's all sorts of subtle ways with increasing care costs, with inheritance tax, with the burden of care costs, and then the NHS for people to subtly make these kind of shifts. And I think cost is a big issue. You've seen that probably in the public debate too. It is ultimately cheaper as a society to put somebody on a pathway to assisted suicide than to give good palliative care. And as others have noted, only a third of palliative care in the UK is centrally funded. 2/3 of that is done by charities and other groups. Canada gives us a really strong indication of where this goes. It went through in a very tight initial reading. It's got wider and wider in the categories, and now over 4% of people 4% of all deaths in Canada are under assisted suicide. And the reasons for that are becoming to do with mental health, to do with physical health, but also to do with financial reasons in terms of housing and the cost of care, of healthcare in Canada. So Danny, some of these critiques, I think it's fair to say, and there's a question around this, or possibly because this is a private member's bill. That probably makes immediate sense to somebody like you and Alicia. Some of the rest of us might be going, private member's bill. Tell us a little bit more about why that's concerning in the process. And you've probably got 2 minutes and then we're going to get to the questions.
2 minutes on the parliamentary process. So most legislation is led through Parliament by the government. And with the parliamentary authorities, they arrange time for that. But there is also provision for individual members of Parliament to bring what's known as private members' bills. And mostly that is done through Fridays. There are Fridays allocated through the course of the year for the consideration of these bills. There's then a ballot, MPs can apply, and the MP that came top of that ballot was Kim Leadbeater, and she has chosen to use her bill to introduce this law. That means that on the 29th of November, it will be debated. There will be most of that day, 5 or 6 hours, will be debating that bill in principle. Parliamentary process has that first debate. It's called the second reading, where they vote on the overall bill. They don't amend it at this stage, but they will vote on it. If it passes that stage, it then goes into a committee where amendments can be thought about and considered. Some can be taken, and then there are further votes in Parliament, which in this case would likely be in March or April next year. So being a private member's bill means the time allocated to it going through Parliament is really quite limited. So there are questions about actually, will there be enough time to give this the scrutiny that is necessary? The committee stage, if it does pass the vote next week is really crucial, and it's really important that it has a rigorous committee stage, which private members' bills don't always get. There's been some indication that in this case it would have a stronger committee stage, but if it passes, we will definitely be pushing for that. The other issue about it being a private members bill is that it isn't engaged with the government departments that are responsible for implementing it. So in this case, the Department for Health. What impact would it have on other services? How would it engage with other laws that are already in place? And that's why there's been some controversy in recent weeks for Wes Streeting's comments, because he's been asking for an assessment to be done for how it would impact the provision of services and what it would cost, and the fact that MPs are being asked to vote for it without that impact assessment having been done beforehand. I'm just going to answer one question because I saw it crop up. MPs have spoken out against it. Some MPs have spoken out in favour. Many we don't know how they're going to vote. But probably most interestingly, Wes Streeting, who is the Secretary of State for Health, has spoken out against this. And so too has Shabana Mahmood, who is the Justice Secretary, who is responsible for the legal system. And I think their interventions are really crucial in this.
Thank you, Danny. Alicia's going to tell us what you can do to respond, and then we're going to pick up some of these questions that are coming through. So, Alicia, if people want to engage, what's the way to do that?
Yeah, amazing. Thanks. I think this is an incredible opportunity for Christians in the church to stand for truth, and as what you were saying in the intro, Peter, to be people that demonstrate communities of compassion. So there are 3 ways my colleague's going to post in the chat for you to take as a link. The first is to say that many MPs remain undecided about how they will vote on the day. And so many have already and are between tomorrow and Monday are convening kind of in person, listening to their constituents to hear what's your view, what's your take, what are your considerations. This is a national conversation, but of course each locality has different provisions in terms of health and social care, so will it impact differently. So one thing that you can do is, do you live in these constituencies that are listed in the chat? And if you do, write to your local MP asking to attend. The other, and most importantly, is to write to your MP to talk about your Christian values, your beliefs, but more importantly, your experience of end of life care. Maybe you are a doctor, you are a GP, you do work in palliative care or a specialist in end of life care. MPs need to hear the Christian voice that are across society, particularly in the health and social care sector, to engage. And we've produced an online kind of tool that you can write. There's a template, but please edit at will, be expressive, do share your specific concerns, encouraging your MP to attend the debate, but more importantly, to vote no at second reading on the 29th. And then the others, if you're a church leader on this call, following this kind of webinar, we will be sharing a link for you to sign a joint letter where we're mobilizing church leaders across denominations, across the UK, who are outspoken and stand in opposition to this. So this is a real moment in the next week for the church to be active, both in prayer, but in action with words, and engaging political leaders with the concerns that you have. So there are the 3 opportunities of how you can engage effectively before the 29th.
Thank you, Alicia. I'm going to ask Tim and the guys if they can spotlight the 3 of us, if that's possible. So we've made the arguments in principle around this bill. We want to uphold the sanctity and the value of life and not support what is ultimately state-sponsored or state-sanctioned suicide. We think the policy is really problematic. Actually, the law is badly drafted. It's partly probably being a private member's bill. But actually, when you look behind the protections, they're paper thin. And finally, we believe the process is a flawed one.